Hi class, welcome. Today's video is on the Transcontinental Railroad and the importance of that particular issue on the national economy at the time. We're focusing now, guys, on a time period around 1849 to about 1870s. And during this time period, railroads were already in existence. Railroads were a thing, people were using trains. The issue, though, was that much of the population in the United States, and correspondingly much of the railroad network that existed, was concentrated back east, of course, throughout all kinds of big cities in the eastern part of the country. People were starting to become more aware, though, of the expanse that existed out west. This is in part due to the gold rush. So there's lots of opportunities out west. The problem, though, is that traveling from east to west was difficult, it was costly, and it was dangerous. And so as a response to these issues, right, we saw the development of this transcontinental railroad tracks that made it possible to get on a train and go all the way across the country. All right, so some economic issues then to pay attention to here. First, we want to know how did this transcontinental railroad come to be? Was this something that was paid for by the government exclusively? Was this something that we left to firms and let them build these tracks hoping to recoup profits later on? In fact, what we saw is that with the Transcontinental Railroad, it was a combination of both public and private interests working together. Private railroad companies were, at the time, hesitant to take on such an enormous cost. It was risky. They weren't confident that it would be worth their investment to build a railroad across the country. And so the federal government intervened and compensated, paid private companies to construct this transcontinental railroad. So the short answer to the question is that it's both public and private dollars that were used in constructing the transcontinental railroad. So how did it get paid for then? I think it's kind of a clever way of appealing to the incentives of firms. What the government did was they hired two different companies to build the railroad. They hired a company called the Union Pacific, and they started in the east and worked their way towards the Pacific Ocean. And at the same time, they hired a second company called the Central Pacific that started in Sacramento, worked their way through the Sierra Mountains, and so the two railroad companies were building track toward one another. All right, so why is that important? It's important because any track that's laid by one of these companies means that there's less opportunity to lay track by the other company. It gave both of these companies incentive to be quick, to be efficient, and to get the railroad completed as soon as possible. The government used a variety of techniques for paying these companies, compensating them for laying track. They were paid directly according to how much mileage they laid down. The government offered them loans, and most significantly, the government gave each of these companies land grants corresponding to the amount of track that they constructed. That just means that the government is handing over land to these companies, and the amount of these land grants was staggering. This was the principal way that the railroad companies were compensated for undertaking this work. All right. As the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, of course, it led to significant changes in the national economy. Economists are somewhat split on the impact on the macroeconomy, just how much higher GDP was as a result of the Transcontinental Railroad being completed, but it's thought to be a positive. Your textbook cites some estimates of about 7% higher production as a result of the railroad being completed, and in my eyes, that's meaningful. But more than that, we also saw that the railroads sort of transformed the nature of the economy. We're producing different types of goods and services now that travel from one part of the country to the other has been made easier. Let me give you some examples. shortly after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, we saw big increases in the media realm. Newspapers became a much bigger deal. Right? And one reason for this is because the railroad allowed people in different parts of the country to be much more connected. Right? Prior to the completion of that Transcontinental Railroad, if you're a person living in, I don't know, Santa Fe, right, you are very much removed from the happenings in New York or Boston or Philadelphia. Right? It takes a long time for news to travel. And of course, with the railroad being completed, it, in a sense, cut down on that distance, not physically, but in other ways. And so people became much more interested in what's happening in the different parts of our country. Newspapers stepped up to meet that need. Okay. We saw that the Transcontinental Railroad accelerated this process by which we were allowed international trade, particularly with Asia. Right? It gave easier access for firms to take goods and services and move them to other parts of the world, and therefore we saw more international trade as a result of the Transcontinental Railroad. New industries were developing and becoming more prominent. All the extractive industries, so think mining and oil and things like that. Lots of these resources that are found out west could be more readily taken advantage of now that the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. Another good example of this was the growing cattle industry, where you ended up seeing ranchers throughout the American West raising cattle, producing beef, and then taking advantage of the railroad to move that cattle back east to those large markets where people were trying to purchase that stuff. So there it is, guys. Right? Ways in which the Transcontinental Railroad has impacted